Hello class, this is the Module 12 lecture on diversity. We're continuing with plants and animals. It's kind of a long chapter where we're just going to be briefly discussing the plants and animals in the world. So learning objectives will be split to the different chapters, but we start off with the plants. So we're going to be discussing characteristics of plants, challenges that they had to face adapting to land, their adaptations, types of bryophytes, new traits that appeared in seedless plants, major classes of the seedless vascular plants. We're going to be talking about gymnosperms and their diversity, parts of a flower and its purpose, life cycle of an angiosperm, a flowering plant, and the diversity of angiosperms. So, plant kingdom, very morphologically diverse, something like 300,000 catalog species. Most of these are going to be flowering plants, very successful group of plants, but most plants are photosynthetic. There are rare instances of parasitic plants that have lost that metabolism, and there are rare instances of heterotrophic feeding for carbon sources and nitrogen sources, such as honeydews and the Venus flytraps. Plants will continue to grow for as long as they're alive. It's not like they have a determinate growth that they reach. And they'll essentially obtain mass till they die. And it's kind of interesting, when we think of plants obtaining mass, you think, oh, this is material brought in from the roots. But really the photosynthetic organ, the organ that's synthesizing the sugars and seeing the growth, is in the leaves. So plants can reproduce sexually with egg and sperm, but some are also producing asexually. And this is some of our very important plant crops are actually reproduced vegetatively through clones. And so when you look at something like a Granny Smith apple, Granny Smiths, all of them are essentially clones of one another. Now, there are advantages to this and there are disadvantages, but this is not a good long-term strategy for propagation. But it will come up again. So one of the focuses of this chapter is going to be the various ways that plants reproduce. So it is thought that the plant kingdom is probably descended from the green algae and at least has a lot of suspiciously consistent characteristics with them. But unlike algae, these plants are going to largely be terrestrial. So in adapting to it in terrestrial life, your biggest challenge is going to be drying out. So previously you were surrounded by water. It was the medium with which you are exchanging gas and nutrients. And that's very convenient because it can be through just simple diffusion. But when plants got to land, they had to start evolving these adaptations to allow them to subsist. And so focusing on moist and humid environments, special adaptations to minimize water loss, and now you're actually having to resist the pull of gravity, right? When you're surrounded by water, water's buoyant, it's holding you up. But when you're supporting your own growth, you need extra support for that. And so that's going to lead into the adaptation of woody tissues, these hard lignin-filled tissues that are not only providing structure, but they're providing you a sort of trachea-like tubule to transport nutrients. And so the four characteristics that are generally ascribed to plants as they succeeded on land: alternation of generations. This is where you have both haploid and diploid cellular stages. A protective sporangium for spore formation. This is just allowing you to keep your spores in sort of a moist environment. A gamettangium that produces haploid cells. This just feeds into this haploid and diploid cellular stages, and it's probably convenient for life on land. And then the evolution of the apical meristem. And so this is occurring at the shoots. It's the stem cell region that is increasing in length through cell division. And so this is an example of alternation of generations. Essentially, you have a sporophyte undergoing meiosis to produce spores. Those spores will continue on through mitosis to create the gametophyte. The gametophyte will then yield the gametes, which will fuse to form the zygote, which then undergoes mitosis to make the sporophyte. So slightly different than the diploid dominant traits that we see in animals, and of course fungi are comparable, but have a whole lot of different strategies that are very close to this. So starting off with the seedless non-vascular plants, this group is going to be called the bryophytes. So extant, still around, arose probably half a billion years ago. They are non-vascular, so they are performing simple diffusion to obtain their nutrients and exchange gases. And they do not have lignin in the cell walls, so they lack a lot of the supporting structure that woody plants are going to have. These are going to include the liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. Liverworts would be something like Marchantia, probably similar to what the first land plants actually looked like. Then you have the hornworts, which are sort of very dominant in these moist environments. They're dominated by a blue-green gametophyte lifestyle. And then you have these simple mosses, which are, of course, very kind of ubiquitous. They're from the tundra to the forest, over 12,000 species, and they like moist environments, but you can find them like in downtown Snyder, Texas as well. So obviously it's a range, but they're very sensitive to air pollution. In fact, they're kind of like an indicator species, a canary in the coal mine, if you will. So those plants are seedless but non-vascular. There are also seedless vascular plants. We call them vascular because they possess xylem and phloem. These are tubules that are allowing conduction of nutrients and water from roots. And these tubules are lined with a lignin-like material, a very tough protein, and essentially the cells die at maturity. And so their cellular bodies are providing structure for this tubule. And so in this seedless group is going to be the club mosses, the lycophytes. These were probably the earliest group of vascular plants. And then probably the more ubiquitous one is the horsetail. So horsetail or equisetum has a central stalk, many joints and nodes. Tends to be very dominant in swamps. You've probably seen this before. But the equisetum is the only genus left in the horsetails. I actually have a ton of the microscope slides made from these guys. But you also have the ferns and the whisk ferns. Whisk ferns are kind of odd in that they do not have the sort of leaf and root, shoots and root system that we would attribute to plants, but instead they're using their stems and the tissues in their stems to perform photosynthesis. And then the ferns are exactly what you recognize when you think of a seedless plant. They have these large, kind of attractive fronds, and they range from the tropics to temperate forests. So the land plants collectively are known as the embryophytes. Then you have the non-vascular bryophytes and the vascular plants. And so vascular plants get distributed even further as seedless versus seeded. We're going to talk about the seededs next. So the first seeded plant is the gymnosperms, or naked seeds. Their seeds and pollen are essentially an adaptation to allow you to exist on land without drying out. And so the gymnosperms are the naked seed plants because they're not enclosing their seeds in a fruit. These were preceded by the progymnosperms, which also had a sort of naked seed. But these are paraphyletic, so that means in a phylogeny we would not ascribe a common ancestor to them. It's just they have characteristics in common that are worth considering. And so the gymnosperms are using abiotic factors for pollination. Most notably is going to be the wind. Other abiotic sources would be something like rain and water, but they are vascularized, so it is a vascular plant. They use tracheids to transport water and solutes, so nutrients. These are the cone bearers. So the male cones, the microsporocytes, give rise to the microspores by meiosis. The female cones will possess ovules, with one of the megasporocyte undergoing meiosis in each ovule to produce those haploid gametes. And so those haploid cells will develop into the gametophyte, and then you'll get fusion into the zygote. The zygote will give rise to the embryo, which is enclosed in a seed coat from the parent plant. And then they're kind of dispersed through the various abiotic and cone-like projections. So diversity, 4 major divisions with over 1,000 described species. The most dominant of which is going to be your conifers, your cone-bearing trees. And they have needle and scale-like leaves as an adaptation to the cold, dry weather, especially up north. We see large continuous bands of forest across the taiga and previously across parts of the tundra. But you also have these cycads, which look a lot like palms, but instead of bearing like palm fruits, they have one big cone. Kind of neat. So while most gymnosperms are abiotically pollinated, the cycads are often insect pollinated by beetles. Then you have the ginkgophytes. This includes the ginkgo biloba. You've probably seen the ads for the supplement for memory. They have these cool fan-shaped leaves. The male and female trees do have some sexual dimorphism there. These are actually extinct in the wild, but they're very highly cultivated. Then you have the ctenophytes. These are sort of the intermediates to the angiosperms, and they possess similar vessel elements to the angiosperms. They really don't have these tracheid like you'd see in most gymnosperms. These are tropical and subtropical, but we actually have a version around here called Mormon tea, or ephedra. And so ephedra is actually a ctenophyte that has, as the name suggests, ephedrine. So it was commonly used as a diet pill supplement at one time. And it's kind of the intermediate to the angiosperms. So segueing into that, angiosperms are the flowering and fruiting plants. Now, of course, they dominate our landscape. With almost 260,000 of the 300,000 of all described plant species are going to be flowering and fruiting. And it has some evolutionary advantages here, some good adaptations. So forming mutualistic relationships with animals in such a way that their seeds can get dispersed. That is the purpose of the fruit and the flower. Fruits are protecting the embryo and then basically allowing the plant to choose how its seeds get dispersed. Like if you want it to be dispersed by a certain animal, you would have a fruit that is evolved in such a way that the relationship between the animal allows only it to digest its seeds and pass them without breaking them down in such a way. You also have flowers in the angiosperms. So flowers are actually composed of multiple organs, 2 that are sterile, 2 that are reproductive. The stipules and the petals are protective, and they're also attracting the pollinators. And so when you look at the petals of a flower, they're brightly colored. There's actually some flowers have little bug runways that can only be seen in the ultraviolet spectrum. Insects see very well in that spectrum. And so these are the sterile organs that are helping the reproductive organs either by protecting them or drawing in the pollinators. And the reproductive organs are carpels and stamens. Some flowers will have both. Some flowers will have neither of these, and then some flower will be male or female. So the carpels and stamens are the reproductive organs. The ovaries are enclosed in the carpels. The stamens actually have a sac-like structure called the anther, which is where you're going to get mature pollen grains, which is the male gametophyte. So diversity of angiosperms, these are very closely related. Think a single division Anthophyta. There are 2 divisions within, the monocots and dicots, which are paraphyletic. The monocots include grasses and true lilies, and then the dicots, or sometimes you see it called eudicots, contain a group of plants that share features but not a common ancestor, very close. You also have these basal angiosperms, and so they likely diverged before that split between cotyledons even occurred. And so they have characteristics of both, although truly most plants you look at will have characteristics of both. But you've got instances like the magnolia, the pepper tree, and laurels had diverged from the angiosperms before this big split between monocot and dicot. So monocots, one cotyledon, as the name implies, usually lack woody tissue. They're going to have parallel veins and no distinct tap roots. They're going to have these very adventitious roots. So this is going to be, again, things like grasses, corn, bananas. Dicots have 2 cotyledons, as the name implies. Instead of having parallel veins, the veins are going to run in a network. It's going to have a thick taproot usually, And it's going to be either herbaceous, meaning it puts off like lots of leaves and stuff, or it's going to possess woody tissue. So angiosperms have a complicated relationship with animals. You want to entice animals to spread your fruits, but you don't want them necessarily eating all your leaves, right? Your leaves are your photosynthetic organs. So angiosperms are using animals, mostly insects, to disperse their seeds, but are resisting herbivory by higher animals with thorns, with trichomes, which are these very fine hairs, and with chemical defenses. So some plants are extremely toxic. And so here we have the perfect and complete flower. An incomplete flower would be a flower that lacks any of the 4 organs we talked about before, but this one has both the male and female floral organs. Okay, so that was plants. Let's move into animals. So for animals, we're going to talk about distinguishing characteristics, animal reproduction and embryonic development, animal classification, protostomes and deuterostomes, simple animals, cnidarians, flatworms, nematodes, arthropods, mollusks, annelids, echinoderms, chordates, jawless and jawed fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and birds, and then derived characteristics in birds, distinguishing features of the 3 main groups of mammals, and the derived features of primates. So it sounds like a lot, but we're really only getting a smattering for every one of these different types of animals. And there's a lot of common features here. So animals are sharing a lot of the common themes here. Outside of the sponges, which instead use specialized cell types, animals are actually characterized by these complex specialized tissues, usually in higher animals organized in some type of organ. So they're all eukaryotic. They all have nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. They're multicellular. They're heterotrophic. There are weird instances where an animal can get photosynthetic components from the food it eats. That would be like the little sea snails that look like sheep. But continuing on, we have a body plan, and this is going to refer to our overall shape, but also hints at our symmetry, which is important. And then the tissue types, there are 4 specialized tissue types that animals have: muscle, neural tissue, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue. And just briefly, we're going to look at some examples of each. We're not really focusing on this right now, but muscle, you have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Smooth muscle is involuntary. It lines your organs and vasculature. Cardiac muscle is unique to the heart and basically just beats all as a unit. And then the skeletal muscle is our voluntary muscle. Then you have neural tissue. That includes largely the neurons, but also their supporting cell types. And so glial cell types, there are 4 to 6, depending on where you are, either the CNS or the PNS. Then you have connective tissue, like blood, surprisingly, is a connective tissue, even though it's liquid, bone, and fat. And so connective tissue really is supporting tissue. Then you have the epithelial tissue. So this includes our skin, our organ linings of the digestive tract, and the respiratory tract. And epithelial tissue is characterized by how many layers you have and what shape it has. And so it can take a number of shapes: cuboidal, columnar, simple, and then have many different layers. Almost all animals are reproducing asexually, but there are instances, even in higher animals, of asexual reproduction. And so in lower animals, you've got things like budding and fragmentation for sponges and hydras and even starfish. And then in higher animals, so your lizards, your rays, maybe even some fish, your reptiles, you've got parthenogenesis. And that is essentially making a clone from an unfertilized egg. So classifying animals, start off with symmetry. There are 3 types of symmetry: asymmetry, which exists only in Porifera, the sponges; radial symmetry, which includes like longitudinal cuts producing a mirror image, basically anything that's not almost directly bilateral. So sea anemones, starfish, sea urchins, stuff like that. Then bilateral is going to be the tetrapods, like the higher animals. A vertical plane will cut front to back to produce a mirror image, such as a goat. Layers of tissues, as mentioned, tissue is a common theme throughout the animal kingdom, And where you derive your tissues from embryologically is actually important. So there are either 2 or 3 germ layers. Diploblasts have 2, they lack the mesoderm. Triploblasts have 3, the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm, and those are giving rise to all of your tissue types. Triploblasts usually have a coelom, an internal fluid-filled body cavity where your organs will actually reside, and we have some divisions within that too. A eucoelomate is a coelom derived from the mesoderm. That is what vertebrates have. Acoelomates do not have a coelom, but they will have a mesoderm region filled with different tissues. So that will be like a flatworm. Then you have pseudocoelomates. So they have a body cavity, but it's derived from another layer. It's partially derived from the endoderm. That would be like a roundworm. And so we consider that a different division. It's a false coelomate. Then you have divisions protostome and deuterostome. A protostome develops its mouth first embryologically. A deuterostome develops its anus first and then its mouth second. And so this is going to be like a vertebrate. So physiologically, when you look at us, we're really just big long tubes from one end to the other. And so this division is really which end of the tube are you developing first. So getting into figure 15.4, we have different types of symmetry. Of course, sponges are asymmetrical. Sea anemone has radial symmetry, so you can cut along any of these planes and it'll still have symmetry. And then a tetrapod, like a goat, is only going to have this bilateral symmetry. So getting into the animals specifically, we have the sponges and cnidarians. Sponges are the simplest of the animals, and they are essentially filter feeding water through this central cavity called a spongiocele. And sponges have this notable opening at the top called an osculum, which is where they sort of export that filtered water. Not going to have true tissue types, but they will have specialized cells. So choanocytes are producing mucus, amoebocytes are delivering nutrients, and they're essentially just diffusing nutrients through these very thin cell layers. Asymmetric symmetry and reproduce by fragmentation or budding. The cnidarians are diploblastic. They're going to possess either radial or bilateral symmetries depending on their morphology. They're marine species that have stinging cells, and so these stinging cnidocytes have pneumatocysts, and these pneumatocysts are little springs basically. They're barbs, pointed barbs with a paralyzing toxic within them. And so, as I mentioned, you have 2 morphologies here. This is really what gives rise to the variation in symmetry. You can have polyps, or you can have bell-shaped medusa. And so this is going to be like the difference between a polyp-shaped hydra or a jellyfish, which is medusan in shape. And these have 2 tissue layers, an epidermis and then a gastrodermis, which is where they're excreting their gastric enzymes. So roughly 10,000 species described for cnidarians across 4 classes. I believe they are starting to do a little bit better with the warming oceans, at least the free-floating medusan kind. But you have the anthozoans that have a sort of 2-shaped body plan. That would include the anemones and coral, which obviously are not doing well with the warming oceans. Then you have the scyphozoa, which are motile jellyfish, have that medusan dominant form with a polyp stage in development. Then you have the box jellies, the cubozoa, similar to jellyfish, but their tentacles are arranged in a box shape. And then you have the hydrozoa, so the man of war, these free-floating marine polyps colonies that, again, still have those stinging cells, right? When you see a man of war on the beach, just leave it alone. But moving on, here is that cnidocyte cell type with the armed pnematocyst. Whenever it's triggered, it shoots out and will inject the target with poison. So moving on to the flatworms, nematodes, and arthropods. Flatworms are going to be triploblastic acoelomates that are parasitic in nature. Instead, they're using a diffusion-based system to digest their food. There are 4 classes here: Turbellaria, Monogenea, Trematodes, and the cestodes. Then you've got nematodes, which are closely related, but they are pseudocoelomates. So have a complex digestive system, chitinous outer skeleton, can have one sex, two sexes, or reproduce asexually by parthenogenesis. So a lot of morphology just within this one class. And then you have the arthropods. 85% of all known species cataloged are arthropods, and most of those are actually beetles. These have chitinous exoskeletons, and they're segmented bodies with jointed appendages. So the coelom will take the form of a hemocell. This houses the hemolymph. It's close to blood. It's a blood analog, but it's like blood where the lymph hasn't been filtered out. And instead of being delivered by a centralized pump, it's actually just sort of bathing the organs, allowing for gas exchange via the spiracles. We call that an open respiratory system. So trilobites are a good example of an arthropod, however they are now extinct. So diversity of arthropods, very high. As mentioned, they make up most of our known species. They are terrestrial, aquatic, they're aerial. The 5 subphylum include the trilobites, which are now extinct, the hexapods, the insects, which make up most of what we have cataloged, the myriapods, which are the millipedes and centipedes, crustaceans, so lobsters, crabs, pill bugs even, and the chelicerata. So these include horseshoe crabs, but also arachnids. Seems like a weird pairing, but they're actually named for a specialized mouth part called a chelicera. And so here we have a house centipede and a millipede. And so these are myriapods. Now, their ancestor, I believe it was Arthropleura, used to get like 9 feet long. Imagine encountering that in a dark alley. So moving on, we've got the mollusks and annelids. These make up a clade called Lophotrochozoa, and that also includes the ribbon worms. These are kind of like the smaller aquatic creatures. Mollusks dominate the aquatic environment, with 23% of all marine species described being mollusks of some kind. They have soft, muscular bodies, but can have a shell, usually calcium-based. They have a radula. Most of them do. Not the simpler ones don't. But a radula is a specialized scraping mouth part. If you ever see footage of them up close, they're quite terrifying. Usually have a muscular foot for locomotion, a mantle for housing organs and the reproductive structures. And there are 7 recognized classes of mollusks. Again, very high diversity here. Aplacophora, Monoplacophora, Polyplacophora, Bivalvia, Gastropoda, Cephalopoda, and Scophopoda. The annelids, also lumped in with these lophotrochs, are the segmented worms. And so they have metamerism, basically a repetition of the interior and exterior features, basically in little subunits that link them together. So these have the chetae, which are chitinous hair-like extensions, basically allowing them to dig into the earth. And it contains the polychaetes and the clitellata. Earthworms are a subclass of this called Oligochaetiata, but have clitellum, a mucus-secreting ring structure, essentially allowing them to encase their eggs in a cocoon, a mucus cocoon, to keep them from drying out. So here we have a terrestrial snail and a terrestrial slug, and they share some features, right? A stomach, foot. The snail has a shell, the slug does not, but they will have radula, scraping mouth parts. Moving on to echinoderms and chordates. So the echinoderms, known for their spiky skin etymologically, have a true coelom with a water vascular system, and these actually have regenerative capabilities. These are going to be like your sea stars, your brittle stars, your sea urchins, your crinoids, and your sea cucumbers. So what happens if you cut a starfish in half and throw both halves back in the water? Well, both will actually regenerate into a full-length adult. That's what we mean by regenerative capabilities. The chordates are mostly vertebrates, but they have some common characteristics, either a notochord or a dorsal hollow nerve cord. And then during embryologic development, they will have pharyngeal slits and a postanal tail. You kind of go through these phases as an embryo, and then we'll lose them as adults. The invertebrate chordates include the tunicates and the lancelets. So they are in chordata, but notably they do not have a vertebral sort of covering on their notochord. So here are the echinoderms: sea stars, brittle stars, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers. Moving into vertebrates, we've got the fishes. So you have jawed fish and bony fish. Jawed fish, like the gnathostomes, were the first to evolve jaws in this context, probably useful for cracking open armored opponents' prey, stuff like that. And then you have the chondrichthyes. These are sharks and rays that have cartilaginous skeletons. The bony fish, osteichthyes, possess a bony skeleton and notably have these swim bladders. And so there's two divisions here depending on the shape of their fin. They can be ray-finned or lobed fins. So Actinopterygii is the ray-fin fishes, Sarcopterygii is the lobe-fin fishes. Then you have the amphibians. Amphibians are known for their dual lifestyle, both in terrestrial and aquatic settings. And this is going to be things like frogs, salamanders, and caecilians, which are these sort of legless amphibians. Notably, they can exchange gases through their skin in a process called cutaneous respiration. There are three clades dependent upon some physical characteristics. You have Eurydelia, the tailed ones. You have Anura, the tailless ones. And you have Apoda, the legless ones. So in a very broad class by itself, you have amniotes. These are reptiles, birds, and mammals that are using some type of protective amniotic membrane to protect their young. And so either a shell or a womb with a placenta or something like that. And so here we have some endangered species. These are species that are at threat of becoming extinct. All of them are vertebrates. So tigers, some species of frog, and the Philippine eagle. So getting into the tetrapods, that means four-footed. Reptiles do have some legless examples, obviously the snakes, but they still have vestigial limbs located within them. They have scaly skin, and they're ectothermic, so they actually maintain their body temperature in close sync with the environment. So four living clades: the crocodilia, which includes alligators and crocodiles; sphinodonts, which includes the tuataras, which look like lizards but are actually their own genus; the squamates, which is the lizards and snakes; and testudines, or turtles. Very closely related to that are birds. Birds have some adaptations that set them apart, though. They are endothermic, and actually they maintain their body temperatures a little bit warmer than even mammals do. They have feathers, which are just pre-adapted scales, modified scales. They have hollow pneumatic bones, so this reduces their body weights for flight. And interestingly, their respiratory system can refresh upon inspiration and expiration with a series of air sacs. And so it's like they're constantly oxygenating their blood in order to keep up with the demands of the big muscles they use for flight. So crocodiles, then you have a chameleon, and then snakes, turtles. These are the reptiles. Finally, we're to the mammals. So mammals have some common traits. Of course, we are covered in hair, and we possess mammary glands. These produce milk for our young. We also have sebaceous glands that produce a waxy lipid-like substance called sebum. It basically helps keep our hair moist, our skin moist, and helps to lubricate. We have these pseudoauriferous glands. So we cool ourselves with evaporative cooling, basically sweating onto our skin surface, and then as that sweat vaporizes, it will take some energy in the form of heat away from us. And very broadly, we have some scent communication here as well. The mammary glands, of course, are producing milk used to feed our newborns. Mammals possess specialized dentition for the processing of food. And notably, we are diffeodont. So we will actually have a different set of teeth from when we're babies from when we're adults. And so you have your baby teeth when you are born, they migrate in, and then the adult teeth will come in behind and push them out. There are three broad groups of mammals depending on how they actually carry their young. The monotremes, also known as the prototherians, are egg layers. So things like platypus, echidna, they're still laying eggs. Then you have the marsupials. These are the pouch developers. They are actually classed as metatherians, similar to us, but we have this kind of true therian nature. We're eutherian in that we develop from a womb. The monotremes notably have this weird 9 to 10 sex chromosome system. I don't know, it works for them. But of course, we use an XY chromosome system to determine our biological sex. And marsupials, of course, are migrating their young, their undeveloped young, to a pouch where they will reside until maturation. Largely only found in Australia and the outlying islands, with the kind of exception to that being the opossums, the possums that exist in the New World. And then the eutherians, of course, are placental mammals. We have a placenta, we grow in a womb, the most widespread. And so for placental mammals, you have insectivores that eat insects, edentata, the anteaters, rodentia, the rodents, chiroptera, the bats, cetacea, the aquatic mammals, carnivora, including the carnivorous mammals, and then primates, which includes humans. And so here are our egg-laying cousins, the monotremes. Then finally, you have the primates. So classes of primates include the lemurs, tarsiers, monkeys, and apes, which include the humans. Descended from tree dwellers, though not all are arboreal anymore. And we have some common characteristics. For instance, our shoulder blades can rotate so that we can brachiate very easily. Big toes, opposable thumbs, and notably stereoscopic vision. There are two groups here, the prosimian and the anthropoid. Prosimians include the tarsiers, lemurs, and bush babies, sort of these smaller monkey-looking things. And then the anthropoid will include the human-like, so the monkeys, the lesser apes, which is basically just the gibbons, and then the great apes. So here's some divisions there. Gibbons, chimpanzees, gorillas, and an orangutan. Anyway, so that was plant and animal diversity. Just go ahead and do the quiz and reflection for that. I hope to have the prompt out for assignment 2 soon.